biofeedback to the introduction. So our next speaker is Glenn Schiraldi. Glenn is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy in West Point and the Vietnam era veteran who obviously knows a lot about disaster, knows a lot about resilience and a lot about the management of these kind of critical incidents. So we thank you very much, Glenn, this evening or this day today to speak with us on a very important thing, and that is about the wounds that children, the hidden wounds from childhood that we carry on with us through our lives, because what happens in childhood often reflects later in stressful relationships. And we would like to hear from you of how we as adult caregivers can help heal not only the children's wounds, but also our own. Thank you very much to Glenn Schiraldi.
Well, thank you, and greetings from sunny Florida. It's a pleasure to be with you all. It's been now over about 40 years that I've been focusing on stress and trauma and resilience. My home base was at the University of Maryland. I've had the opportunity to work on and study and write about various aspects of stress, but the one that is intriguing me the most is this top right topic of adverse childhood experiences. In terms of its cost, ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, have been called the most important unaddressed public health problem facing the nation. The bad news about ACEs is that hidden wounds from childhood adversity lead to untold suffering and dysfunction in the adult years, including our ability to relate to and care for children. The good news is that much of this suffering, much of this dysfunction can be significantly alleviated and thereby make adults more effective resources, both for themselves, but the children they care for. Quick dive into the bad news. Back in the late 90s, two medical doctors examined, as Antoinette said, over 17,000 cases of records, and they found that 10 adverse childhood experiences predicted a wide range of harmful health outcomes in a stepwise fashion, meaning the more ACEs, the greater the likelihood of some kind of health disorder. They found that 2/3 of the subject pool had experienced at least one of the 10 ACEs, comprised of 3 kinds of abuse: emotional, physical, sexual, emotional and physical neglect, and living in a household where there's an absent parent, domestic violence, drugs, mental illness, suicide, or incarceration. The researchers found that ACEs tended not to occur in isolation. Thus, if a father was an alcoholic, he might have also been an abuser, and time alone did not heal. What did time not heal? If you look at a sampling of the disorders that are predicted by ACEs, both from the original and subsequent studies, this is what ACEs have been found to predict. And if you reach exposure to 4 or more ACEs, then the risk increases typically between 2 and 5 times. But for certain disorders like drug dependency, Alzheimer's, that risk increases 11 times. Suicide attempts go up 37 times. And once the ACEs score goes to 6 or more, it is linked to a loss of life of nearly 20 years. In a nutshell, ACEs imprint and change the brain, the biology, the sense of self in ways that affect adults throughout life if they're not addressed. A couple of quick points about the original research. This was a largely white, middle-class, educated, employed, health-insured group, and in groups that are impoverished, minority, or protectors like cops, we see greater exposure and therefore greater risk for developing problems. Only 10 of the most common stressors were used in the original ACEs research. And of course, there's many others. Loss of any member for any reason, whether it's deportation or deployment or being adopted, marital discord of the parents, date rape, surgery, serious surgery in the child or the adult, serious prenatal or perinatal stress that can be transmitted to the fetus or the child in various ways, like postpartum depression, surgery, unwanted pregnancy. One researcher noted that separation from a primary caregiver is like combat stress to a troop. The cost to the nation runs in the many billions in terms of health care, welfare, criminal justice, special ed, lost economic productivity, and fatalities. Quickly, why? Oops, sorry, going the wrong way. Here is the ACEs model, and you see down here that ACEs are linked to stress-related conditions that I just mentioned. And Flitti notes that we err to treat the smoke, meaning the conditions, without treating the underlying cause. You will also notice that dysregulated stress is central to the ACEs stress-related conditions outcome. Dysregulated stress dysregulates or disrupts all the systems of the body. For example, just briefly, dysregulated stress influences brain development, causing the brain to remain on high alert well after the stressor hits. Quickly about the brain is going through a tremendous growth spurt between the last trimester and the first year of life. 1 million neural connections made per second. And the way the brain develops and wires during this period has incredible implications for life. Of course, the left brain is verbal, it's logical, it's thinking, it processes and recalls memories through words and logic. The left brain is not even fully online until about year 3, meaning it's not developed enough to be playing a major role. The right brain, on the other hand, is online and functioning during these 3 critical years with its strong connections to emotional survival regions of the brain. It oversees basically nonverbal, non-conscious processing of memories, storing memories with images, with sensations, with visceral states like I feel sick to my stomach, I have a tightness in my chest, constriction in the throat, survival tendencies like I don't know why, but I always tense up and feel like I'm ready to run or fight when I get stressed, and feeling tone, a felt sense, a nameless dread, sense of inadequacy. Again, all of this is mostly nonverbal and often typically beneath conscious awareness. The right brain is dominant for the first 3 years of life. Thereafter, it's dominant for emotional processing, including trauma memories, because the left brain goes offline during toxic stress, no matter how old we are. And these negative neural pathways are ingrained in the first 3 years, and they persist over the course of a lifetime. The endocrine system, for example, one of the major stress hormones is cortisol. When it is dysregulated from dysregulated stress, we see links to obesity, inflammation, immune dysfunction, improper brain development, sleep, and mood disruption. Even the way genes are expressed, only about 5% of disorders are solely determined by genes. The epigenome, represented in blue here, that exists alongside of the DNA strands, is subject to stress. It's like a dimmer switch on the light. It determines how genes are expressed, whether they're turned on or off. Environmental stress changes the epigenome. The epigenome can be passed on to the next generation. Telomeres are the tips of chromosomes, and they too are influenced by environmental stress. Much like the tips of of a shoelace, when it unravels, the shoelace is in trouble. So are the chromosomes, and the ability to develop the brain and regulate cortisol and so forth occurs from toxic stress. And we can't put the whole picture in perspective without talking about attachment psychology. Secure, loving attachment to caregivers regulates stress and promotes healthy brain development. When the child has a adult who is caring and loving and attentive and who enjoys the child imprints, again, mostly in the right hemisphere, non-verbally, I'm loved, I'm worthy, I'm adequate. And we see that translate later to self-esteem, feeling one and connected to our emotions, our body, resilience, health, and so forth. The child in a secure attachment situation internalizes calmness. Mom goes away, but she comes back. I realize that things get set right, and I learn to tolerate distress. Trust generalizes in the securely attached person. One study even found that securely attached kids are more likely to view God as loving. Physiologically, oxytocin, the calm and connect hormone, is secreted in secure attachment. Now, all of that, we all know that there are certain people that we look at that seem to have it together on the outside, they're accomplished, and yet they dislike themselves, and words and logic doesn't persuade them otherwise. And so insecure attachment, particularly in the first 3 years of life, impact the brain, how it's developed, and our sense of self. The brain, again, is wired to be on high alert, and this plays out in adulthood. We know now that both parents impact the child's development uniquely and in complementary ways, and that attachment disruptions get imprinted. So, for example, in the first months, weeks, or couple of years of life, the primary caregiver may, not wanting the child, look with disgust at the child and maybe say angry words. The child doesn't understand those words because the left brain isn't online yet, but imprints non-verbally shame and survival impulses. Cortisol impacts the epigenome, and the whole cascade of things that I've just talked about occurs. Insecure attachment, unlike secure attachment, which is fairly secure, is malleable, subject to kind, non-judgmental awareness. So let's talk about the good news and the solutions. Healed adults make more effective caregivers and teachers, able to be 100% there for children. The good news is there are many new and effective healing strategies based on new findings of neuroscience, of attachment, of trauma, and resilience psychology. The key principles, healing is not about blaming, it is about understanding, about taking responsibility for healing those inner wounds. And what is needed is a comprehensive plan to soothe and settle not just old memories, but present experiences that are triggered by the old memories and the associated reactions, and that improve well-being generally. The hope of healing lies in the fact that the brain is plastic. We can rewire the brain to regulate the stress response, the epigenome, the telomeres, and the harmful programming regarding the way we experience the self. Turns out that traditional talk therapy is usually not the best starting point for trauma healing because it talks to the left brain, and of course, as I mentioned, it's the right brain that's really storing and processing and managing all the trauma memories in nonverbal ways. So the exciting developments in recent years describe bottom-up strategies. These are body-centered strategies pioneered by Ogden and Levine and van der Kolk. And they also weave in imagery, which is a right brain functions. The healing elements are safety, calm, compassion, environment, acknowledging, understanding, taking responsibility to heal, and I would add reinforcing and appreciating the strengths that have helped people to get to their as far as they have in life, which indicates resilience. So here is the 8-step comprehensive healing plan. Many of the skills that are taught here are useful not just for rewiring the brain, but also in everyday life. These can be used in a self-managed way because for a variety of reasons, many people will not get therapy even when it's indicated. These can also be used with a therapist in the model. We're talking here psychoeducation and individual counseling for intervention and ultimately for prevention. So you notice there's a kind of a logical sequence here. The first 4 steps prepare the brain to deal with the traumatic memories. Steps 5 and 6 is actually reworking the old childhood trauma memories. 7 is transitioning beyond suffering to a satisfying life. And then 8 is knowing when and how to enlist professional aid when it's needed. So briefly, if we could talk about each one of these. Regulating dysregulated stress arousal. There is a biology of calm and a biology of trauma, which when the suffering person understands it, can normalize their suffering. This is the biology of calm. There's a resilient zone, a window of tolerance when stress arousal is neither too high nor too low. Within that window, you'll notice that the systems of the body increase and decrease in synchrony. The nervous system is in balance, and the left brain, we're hardwired in this zone to be able to speak. So I can give and receive support and reason with, negotiate with a perpetrator and an offender. What happens in trauma, 70% of the time people get hyper aroused. That is, they get stuck on high. And again, the left brain goes offline. It's like the brain says, I don't have enough time to think or to talk. I only have enough time to move and feel strong, motivating emotions. And so when people are stuck here, they're not susceptible to logic and thinking. 30% of the time, people who are traumatized go into the collapse zone where they're stuck on low, playing dead but not really playing. It's a hardwired response to overwhelming stress, particularly if, say, a child was held down, unable to move when trauma was experienced. And so the idea, the primary goal of therapy is to get people back in the resilient zone where they can think about, talk about, calmly process, and ultimately tell with words their story. So the strategies involve body-based skills, which are bottom-up skills. Calm the body so you can calm the survival and emotional brain, and that ultimately calms and brings back online the left brain. And so how that's done, for example, a skilled clinician might say, I notice you're really stressed, you hunch your shoulders, you're white, your complexion turns white when you tell your story. How about we put that story aside and just track what's going on in your body? The simple act of noticing what's going on in the body brings back online the various regions of the brain. And what happens if you were to stand up and now push against that imaginary perpetrator and bring to completion the movement that you're thwarted from executing? Another one is to knead, a very simple technique to just experiment. Track what happens when you squeeze your arm and go up and down in different ways, up and down your forearm. We can ground in the body, putting our hand on different parts of the body, and ultimately including putting our hand where one experiences the stress and track it. We can change postures and track how that feels differently, and we realize we're in control of our reactions. I've developed a 5-minute foot-to-head stress reducer incorporating various strategies from around the world that basically track and weave in compassion and other affirmative emotions. Because distressing emotions can maintain dysregulated physical stress, it's critical to learn strong distressing emotion skills. Again, this is useful for everyday as well as for processing. So, for example, to me, mindfulness is amazing, and the ultimate end goal is to be able to sit with whatever we experience with just a kind, accepting way. Whatever I feel is okay. Compassion, which is key to mindfulness, stimulates oxytocin, the calm and connect hormone, which counters many of the deleterious effects of cortisol. And so, not surprisingly, compassion practice is linked to less anxiety, depression, shame, stress, PTS symptoms. If you then add a layer on top of mindfulness called self-compassion that starts with compassionate bodily awareness and then weaves into that kind statements like, this is a moment of suffering, everyone suffers, I'm not alone, may I bring the compassion that I need, may I bring the kindness I need. That seems to work even more effectively. We can borrow eye movements and tapping from trauma treatments. Singer's pass-through technique, where you just say, go into your deepest center and see that the sensations, the visceral responses, the images are not who you are. Just notice and watch them float through a kind, open-hearted heart. There are 9 keys to caring for the brain that prepare the brain to optimally function. And these 9 keys work together to fertilize neurons so that they're ready to make new connections, new neural pathways, keep out poisons from the brain by strengthening the blood-brain barrier. I always have trouble with that one. To reduce inflammation. The big 3 are a Mediterranean-style diet, which strengthens the microbiome, the gut microbes. The gut speaks directly to the brain. Before I leave that, energy drinks, which kids are using a lot more today. The Army did research and found it does just the opposite of what we'd hoped it would do. It makes people more tired, more stressed, more anxious. And so Mediterranean diet, sleep and exercise, and just sometimes very simple applications of those 3 is very, very effective. In a matter of months, one study found it reduced brain aging 9 years in sedentary, mildly cognitively impaired adults. We can treat destroyer medical conditions like sleep apnea. We can minimize exposure to things that are toxic to the brain, like pesticides and pollutants, and certain drugs like sleep aids. Even caffeine, nicotine in excess are harmful. Exposure to nature and sunlight and managing stress. We can strengthen and stabilize the nervous system with imagery, soothing imagery that mimics secure attachment needs. For example, one can just imagine as an infant being in the presence of a kind, loving, nurturing, soothing voice, melodic tones, being cradled, caressed. Because anything's possible in imagery. One then tracks how that feels. We can learn to self-nurture, where the way that plays out is think of yourself now as that same vulnerable infant, where you, the wiser adult, comes and even though you're imperfect, you're fully committed and willing to be there and support and cheer on that child, and think how the message that sends to the adult with children. Now we get to the float back strategies, which now talk about using all of the skills that one has learned so far to bring up present distress. In other words, event I was criticized at work or when I went home, and I overreacted. And so you start out by just calming the present reaction, and then floating back and calming with all the soothing, compassion skills that have been learned heretofore to calm and soothe and heal the earliest memory that seems to be driving those severe emotions. Shame is ubiquitous in trauma survivors, and we can see here that ACEs and attachment disruption leads to shame, which then maintains dysregulated stress arousal. And often this is ingrained in the earliest weeks and months of life. It's at the core of much suffering, much dysregulated stress. It's buried, it's secretive, and the antidote is to bring it to light, to stop running, to neutralize it with compassion. And there are a variety of activities. For example, one is in imagery. See yourself as a youngster standing up a shaming caregiver. And you may bring into that imagery an older adult, be it yourself who's wiser, or a protective adult who then gives a child the protection, the encouragement that is needed.
5 more minutes.
Right. Transitioning skills are applying the skills we've learned to enhance our life satisfaction. And so, for example, self-respect skills. We know that shame can be imprinted from mistreatment in the early years, but it can also result from choices we make later in life. Maslow said that when we violate species values, in other words, values that are valued around the world, that it registers to our discredit, or the opposite type of behavior registers to our credit. And so skills to reconcile with our imperfections, including forgiveness skills. We can nourish the soul, which is, as Singer and Valiant and others have said, is what experiences our deepest, most sublime emotions. And so there are spiritual imagery healings and reflections on spiritual religious practice that people might find helpful. Joy skills ties in with positive psychology research. For example, remembering the good times and then track how that feels in your body. Creating a new future skills is, you might imagine crossing it over a bridge to a new normal, happy life. Try it out, track it. And then the final step is enlisting needed aid. And in just the few seconds we have left, I just want to share with you the two that I'm so impressed with. One is something called accelerated resolution therapy, which is a derivative of EMDR, which is a very well-validated trauma treatment, only it goes much beyond trauma, EMDR. It starts with regulating the felt sense with eye movements and imagery, and then it goes to erasing and replacing disturbing memories and transitioning then to a satisfying life. This next one, intensive trauma recovery, is another very gentle, very rapid treatment that uses imagery and art and gentle recounting of one's story to integrate the memory fabrics, to give the memory structure, beginning, a middle, and end, a completion of a story. So in very quick, broad brush terms, that's the way early childhood wounds can be healed. I'm delighted to chat more with anybody who wishes to chat about this. My contact information is there, and turn the time over to any questions or discussion you might wish to have here.
Thank you very much, Glenn. That's a wonderful example of staying within the time frame.
Well,
Let's give you a good applause from everybody. Thank you. I think it is most important part of what we need to understand, because working with families and with children, we realize that many of the parents, as we heard on Thursday evening in one of our opening sessions, that many of the parents are struggling with unexpressed emotions or unidentified emotions, and whether those are from their early childhood experiences that they are suppressing and that then affect their parenting and resulting in the child having difficulties at school or then not understanding the child and bringing this whole concept of confusion that is the result of early childhood experiences to the fore. So I think it's the work that you've been doing and this healing strategies is to me just amazing how we can actually heal. And from the positive psychology perspective, always believing that it's not the end when you're 7 years old. You can move forward. You can, even when you are retired. So let us get some questions. Can we clear the shared screen? Okay, that's it. Okay, I don't see any hands yet. Hands for questions. Here comes Amy Poka. I don't see your face, but you're welcome to. Okay, there you are. Thank you.
Puka.
Hello,
I'm Puka in this session, and Sue is one of my favorite people because I have the last name Schaefer too.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So you're the first question this evening. Question to Glenn.
Yes, the question that I have, I'm an attorney, retired attorney, and I wonder what outreach has been made into other professions, legal, medical, so forth and so on. Is there a part of disaster shock that has moved in that direction?
You know, I don't know the answer to that, but it's 23 years since the original ACEs research came out, and here we are still struggling. Like, now what are we going to do with it? And there's always a lag between the research and the practical application. So, you know, I work in a foundation that deals with cops and firefighters and military, and we go all over the place trying to train people in these kind of things that we were just talking about. And, you know, people like you that are getting the word out, but it takes a while.
Thank you.
I think it is a challenge, and the systems are so wide and so broad that we need to address. Our next question comes from Tom.
Thank you, Glenn, for your presentation. That was excellent. My question is, are there any supports that you're aware of that are particular to secondary trauma experienced by caregivers, by therapists, by first responders, those kinds of things?
Well, I don't really differentiate. I mean, I think people manifest stress in different ways, whether it's secondary or primary exposure. People still are stressed and they still need skills to cope with it. So there's a whole literature on vicarious traumatization. But as I read through it, it still comes down to people are wounded and they need to have healing skills. And so I don't really differentiate the coping skills from the two groups.
Okay. There's Brian with a question.
This is not actually a question, it's a comment. I cannot remember ever seeing a presentation on healing techniques that's so nicely and gently weaved in research that supports the effectiveness of those techniques. And so to have that empirical component linked in is it's very powerful. It speaks very strongly to us who value evidence-based support. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Yeah, my field is public health at the university, and so I always thinking, how do you translate this stuff so that people in the schools or people in the front lines of the military or cops can use it? And I think it's always, that's the hardest part. But I think there are a lot of skills that we can learn.
Yeah. Thank you, Glenn. That was very important for me as well. I have sort of a question comment which links across the fields. Is I am now in this phase of retirement and not directly connected to school, and had to relocate back to my country where I was working in another country. My children are grown up, but they live fairly far away. The pandemic brought about a situation where grandparents, in some cases, a grandparent might stay in the country of origin while the children migrate to another country, or the grandchildren are now far away. Now, the pandemic, in the previous session, was saying that the pandemic did the best coping was for connecting with the family. Your session tells me also that connecting with the family could be the cause of my distress or my stress. And so I was just wondering how in the disaster shock, but also in your work in the helping profession, do you bring these separated people to heal across distance, across the lockdowns, across the separation anxiety that we now have? As a retired person, I cannot in my new community connect through the school to gain some of these helping creations, and the communities have become so isolated even before the pandemic, and now even more. So your connection to social networks have now been further jeopardized. So your coping of using contact with family, of contact with friends and peers are challenged. So how do you do the healing? If it's not only individual, I mean, individual, I can sit here in my study and work out that, but how do I get to that connections that help me to heal?
Boy, there's a lot to that question. Let me just throw a few thoughts out. You're right, I think. Sometimes the problem is the family, and reconciliation may or may not be a possible outcome. And so I think there are some skills that can be taught in the meantime. Looking at the offender with compassion, as you would look at ourselves for our mistakes with the same compassion, I think that comes under the forgiveness rubric. I think sometimes reconciliation is possible in the forgiving process, and that's wonderful when it happens. Just be aware that it may not happen, in which case you heal and you make constructive connections with others. If say an abusive father or mother is not willing or open or doesn't know how to because their own history of trauma,
or is already dead,
well, there are ways to do that too, in writing and stuff, or in imagery, because anything's possible in imagery. There are different ways to heal with offenders, but I think there's a very interesting debate about, is forgiveness optional? Personally, I think it's necessary, though I think it may not be the first thing you do. It may be the last thing you do after you heal. And so it goes back to this, we don't want to go for a quick fix. We want to heal. We want to develop coping skills and strengths. And then if you can reconcile, terrific, and accept if that's not possible.
I have to add to that I agree with you fully. And I did it before by doing a ritualistic healing with the empty chair and bringing and creating a ritual of a woman that had to forgive her mother. And then actually bury, physically, we went to the beach and we actually created a burial scene of letting go of these negative emotions that was still haunting her and made her very hard to deal with her own children. So the using ritual in the whole process of healing.
Yeah, I love rituals. The only caveat sometimes I use is that maybe you don't want to do that prematurely. Maybe
no, I agree. Yeah. No, that was after a long period of work with her. Okay, anybody, any more questions? I don't see any more hands. Well, in that case, I think as this wraps up our evening of wonderful togetherness, I did have somebody that was going to make the thank yous, but since I don't see that person with us, I'm going to do it on behalf.